The sky that evening looked bruised by sorrow, as though some unseen hand had dragged a brush dipped in fading amber and violet across the horizon, letting the colors leak downward in tired streaks that clung to the quiet plains like whispered regrets. And somewhere beneath that hushed sky walked Nia Willow, aged 20, each step slow, every breath trembling as though the world had become too large and too empty for her all at once, and she wondered if grief had weight because it dragged her bones lower than the dust itself. Her moccasins scuffed softly against the earth as she moved toward the dim silhouette of a wooden cabin standing lonely at the edge of the prairie, its lantern glowing faintly like a single kind eye refusing to close, and the closer she came, the harder her throat tightened, until she finally climbed the porch steps, hesitated once, and whispered through cracked lips, "I lost my family today, can I stay with you tonight?" Not knowing whether mercy or judgment would answer her in the dark. For a moment she heard nothing but the wind, and she felt fear rise like a cold pulse in her chest. The cabin door opened just enough to show the tall, steady figure of Colton Reyes, age 30, his shadow stretching across the porch like a protective barrier he himself wasn't sure he had the right to offer, and he studied her with eyes that held a history of caution carved into their edges, as though the world had taught him far too often how kindness could turn into blame when the sun rose again. His gaze drifted over her trembling fingers and the sorrow pooling in her posture, and something inside him, some quiet memory of being abandoned in his own time of need, shifted, nudging him toward a decision he feared the town would not understand come morning. The lantern's warm glow brushed lightly over the tear tracks on her dusty face, stirring a gentleness in him he hadn't felt in years, and he opened the door a little wider, his voice rough with uncertainty as he said, "Come in, if you need a place to rest." The moment she stepped into the golden lamplight, he felt the weight of the choice settle heavily in his chest, though he could not yet tell whether it would anchor him in trouble or lead him someplace he never dared imagine, and the question lingered at the edge of his thoughts. Inside, the cabin smelled of pine resin and wood smoke, that old comforting perfume of solitude that had once steadied Colton but now felt strangely inadequate with a grieving stranger standing in the middle of it, and Nia wrapped the blanket he offered around her shoulders as if clinging to the last surviving piece of warmth left in her shattered world. She sat beside the fire, its flickering gold light catching in her dark hair as she tried to steady her breathing, and for a moment she couldn't find the strength to speak, her grief too fresh and too raw to shape into proper words. When she finally whispered that her grandmother had passed away that very morning, her last living relative, the final thread tying her to the comfort of belonging, Colton listened with his head bowed, feeling her pain reverberate through the quiet space like the echo of a bell struck too hard. He wanted to offer comfort, but he knew that words sometimes wounded more than silence, so he simply placed a cup of warm water near her hands and sat across from her, the firelight bridging the space between them with a fragile kind of understanding neither dared disturb too quickly, though he wondered what might unfold when dawn arrived and solitude no longer protected them. Morning crept over the plains with a pale, tired glow, the air holding that thin calm that comes before judgment arrives, and Nia stepped onto the porch with Colton to help him gather water, wanting to repay even a fragment of the kindness he'd shown her the night before. But already the world was shifting around them, for a pair of riders slowed as they passed on the nearby trail, their eyes lingering on Nia far too long, their whispers slicing through the quiet like small, deliberate knives meant to sting without leaving visible marks. Colton tensed, jaw clenching as he subtly stepped between her and the riders, shielding her not because she was weak, but because he could feel the sharpness of the town's prejudice gathering like storm clouds in the distance. He didn't speak of it, but the shame burned behind his ribs, the familiar shame of caring too deeply in a world that punished softness, and he wondered how quickly rumors would spread now that someone had seen her here. The thought unsettled him, curling into his lungs like unwelcome smoke, and he couldn't help asking himself what, exactly, he had set into motion by letting her cross his threshold. Yet as the day stretched forward, something gentle began weaving itself between them in small, unexpected moments, and Nia found herself teaching Colton how to bead a thin bracelet, her fingers guiding his roughened hands with patient precision that made the air between them hum softly. In turn, he helped her mend a loose board on the chicken coop, showing her how to angle the hammer so she wouldn't bruise her fingers, their shoulders brushing once, then twice, each touch sending a quiet ripple through the stillness they shared. They spoke only when words felt necessary, but their silences grew warm, held comfortably between them like a blanket nobody wanted to fold away too soon. Colton caught himself lingering on the way she tucked hair behind her ear, and Nia noticed how carefully he placed tools back where they belonged, as though order itself calmed him in ways he rarely admitted. Something in him softened each time she smiled, and something in her steadied each time he looked at her as if she mattered, and yet neither of them dared let their thoughts wander too far into that blooming tenderness, though curiosity began tugging at them both. The tenderness nearly shattered one late afternoon when a handful of ranchmen rode up to Colton's property, dust swirling around their boots as they dismounted with faces carved from suspicion and superiority, their voices sharp as they accused him of risking trouble by letting a young native woman stay under his roof. Colton stepped forward, his expression turning cold as a canyon shadow, though his voice remained steady when he told them their business did not stretch onto his land. Behind him, Nia stood in the doorway, her heart thudding painfully as she realized her presence was drawing heat toward a man who had only ever shown her refuge, and guilt tightened its grip on her chest until she couldn't bear it any longer. When the men finally left, though not without promising the whole town would hear of this, she returned inside and quietly began packing the few belongings she had, hoping to slip away before the storm fell fully on Colton's shoulders, her fingers trembling around the small bundle as she stepped toward the door with silent determination, though something inside her broke with every step she took. Colton noticed immediately, blocking the doorway not with force but with a kind of gentle certainty that made her breath catch, and he reached out slowly to take the bundle from her hands before setting it carefully on the table behind him. For a long moment, he simply looked at her, his eyes searching, conflicted, and then softening with a truth he had been trying to ignore. He told her she didn't need to leave, that he didn't want her to leave, and that the trouble he feared was nothing compared to the thought of her vanishing back into a world that had already taken too much from her. Nia tried to protest, saying she couldn't let him bear the consequences of her presence, but Colton stepped closer, his voice low and resolute as he said that shelter meant nothing if it wasn't offered fully, without conditions, without retreat. Tears gathered in her lashes as she realized she had been chosen, genuinely, willingly chosen, and Colton's hand brushed her cheek with a tenderness so unexpected it made her knees weaken, though neither of them were ready to name what this growing bond truly was. The bond became undeniable a few weeks later when Colton asked her if she would marry him so the world would no longer question the place she held in his life, and though he spoke quietly, his eyes carried a devotion that steadied her heart like an anchor finding ground. They arranged a simple ceremony behind the small white church on the hill, the sun lowering itself in honeyed ribbons that painted the landscape with a softness that felt almost like blessing. Nia wore a beaded dress she had stitched with her own hands, each pattern shaped by memories of her grandmother's teachings, and Colton stood waiting beneath an arch of cottonwood branches, his breath catching slightly when he saw her approach as though the world had folded itself into this single moment. Their vows were spoken softly, promises of protection, respect, and choosing each other even in the face of judgment, and when Colton kissed her palms and she tied a beaded cord around his wrist, the air around them seemed to hush in reverence, as if the plains themselves understood what was being forged between them, though neither knew then what joy the coming year would bring. Time moved gently after that, folding into a rhythm of shared chores, warm mornings, and soft laughter drifting through the cabin as Nia found herself pregnant, her belly rounding with the steady promise of new life, and Colton transformed into a man nearly unrecognizable in his tenderness, always anticipating her needs before she even voiced them. He tied her boots for her when bending became difficult, carried her to bed on nights when exhaustion pressed too heavily on her limbs, cooked meals with shy determination even when he fumbled the seasoning, and whispered little stories to the growing babies each night, resting his hand on her stomach as though greeting old friends returning home. Nia often woke to find him watching her with quiet awe, tracing her silhouette with his gaze as if storing every detail in some sacred place within him, and she felt her heart expand with a kind of love that felt both ancient and brand new. As her due date neared, she found herself wondering what their daughters would look like, dreaming of their tiny fingers and shared features, though curiosity soon gave way to urgency one stormy night when her contractions struck with the suddenness of lightning. Rain lashed against the cabin walls as the storm roared outside, but inside Colton moved with unwavering calm, helping Nia breathe through each wave of pain, holding her hand with a strength that steadied her even as the world blurred around her. Sweat clung to her brow, tears gathering in her lashes as she pushed through the agony, but Colton never left her side for even a moment, whispering encouragement, brushing her hair from her face, and telling her she was stronger than any force in this world. When the first baby's cry filled the room, Nia sobbed with relief, and moments later, the second cry joined the first, their tiny voices weaving together like a duet of life blooming into the world. Colton's tears fell openly as he wrapped the twins in soft blankets, his hands trembling with awe as he placed them gently into Nia's arms, and she kissed each infant's forehead as if blessing them with everything she had endured to bring them here, though deep in her chest she felt something even more powerful stirring as she looked up at the man who had never once let go of her hand. Their life afterward unfolded like a long, tender exhale, the once lonely cabin now echoing with the soft coos and bright laughter of their twin daughters, who grew beneath the watchful shadow of cottonwoods and the boundless sky. Neighbors who once whispered now nodded respectfully when passing by, their judgments slowly dissolving as they witnessed the quiet devotion with which Colton and Nia raised their girls, the remarkable steadiness of their bond speaking louder than any rumor could. Colton often found himself pausing in the doorway to watch Nia feeding the babies beneath the lantern's glow, her face serene, her strength woven through every gesture, and he realized that love had not just softened his life, it had remade it entirely. And sometimes, when the daughters slept and the world hushed into a peaceful dusk, he would step outside onto the porch and remember the night she first arrived, lost and trembling, his heart folding around the memory with a reverence that held both gratitude and awe, for he knew that moment had changed the shape of every dawn that followed. And if you stood beside him on that quiet porch now, years later, he would turn to you with a knowing softness in his eyes, the kind that comes only from surviving sorrow and finding unexpected grace on the other side, and he would tell you that life often rearranges itself around the smallest acts of courage, acts like opening a door when fear urges you to close it, or choosing to stay when the world insists you should run. He would say that love rarely enters with grand declarations, but instead grows in the quiet corners of shared pain and gentle understanding, in the steady hands that lift you when grief has hollowed you out, and in the simple, sacred moments when someone chooses you again and again without hesitation. And he'd remind you that even in the loneliest seasons of your life, when loss feels like a horizon you cannot cross, a single moment of kindness can redirect your entire story, carrying you toward a future you never knew was waiting just beyond the dusk, lingering like a promise you can finally learn to trust.